Zoom, come on over here, Zoom. Could I get you any noise on your end will flip the view just until we get going. Maybe just be kind of quiet.
Okay.
Um, okay, here. Zoom, zoom. Welcome to the Energy Talk. Welcome to the Energy Talks podcast. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and my guest today is Daniel Breton, president of Electric Mobility Canada, which a few months ago released Electrifying Progress, a comprehensive economic outlook of the Canadian EV industry. So, welcome to Energy Talks, Daniel.
I'm happy to be here.
Just to clear things up, did you release this in February and you're just I had a couple of different dates for it, including yesterday.
No,
Just
that the official launch was actually yesterday.
okay. I'm glad we cleared that up. I'm really excited about this because we follow the electrification of transportation at the global level. And
hmm
so maybe let's just talk about that for a moment. I'm sure you follow those trends as well. Um, my take on this is that China has essentially disrupted the global auto industry, and we're seeing the number of vehicles manufactured in China rise dramatically. We're seeing the number of battery electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles rise dramatically. We're seeing China beginning to export into the global south. How big a role does that disruption play in the consideration of your strategy for Canada?
Actually, I've been working in this space for decades now. So before China was really involved into this, there was some research being done in Europe and the US, even in Canada, when we're talking about the future of electrification. Research done at Dalhousie University, for instance, in Nova Scotia, Hydro-Quebec in Quebec. Um, so all of this was very theoretical for most people. But China, like other countries, have decided to embrace the transition to electric vehicles because they were so far behind when it came to building traditional vehicles, diesel or gas. They were lagging so far behind the Japanese, the Americans, the Europeans. So they said, well, might as well leapfrog the technology and go to electric. So they had, let's say, a 20-year head start compared to other countries and car makers who were very good at making gas or diesel cars, and the business model that they had was based on that. So people did not take China seriously until maybe 5 years ago. So as recently as that, and I remember in 2014 I was in Germany talking to folks from BMW and Volkswagen, and they were talking to me about clean diesel back then. So that was a year before Dieselgate. And they said, no, we're not going electric. It's either going to be hydrogen or diesel. And I said, well, I'm not sure about that. But the thing is that it's really hard to change your frame of mind when you've been working for decades in an industry. You have plants that make cars and trucks and buses, diesel or gas. You're good at what you're doing, especially if you're German. There's a pride in that. So the wake up call was brutal for a lot of them, and it's getting even worse nowadays with Chinese manufacturers getting more and more market share in Europe.
I've interviewed Michael Dunn of Dunn Insights quite a bit about what's going on in China, and because he consults there now that he's left General Motors. And he says that there was a talk for a long time about how China would catch up and its auto industry would expand, and it didn't happen. Sort of all of the 2010s, and then all of a sudden in 2019, 2020, it did happen. And a lot of the legacy automaker, their executives were caught completely flat-footed. They had other plans, as you point out, into clean diesel or whatever it might be. Look at Toyota, thinking that it would run on hybrids for decades more. And given the size of those corporations, and as you point out, all of the infrastructure for plants and supply chains, pivoting from that is almost, I mean, that's a big, big task.
It is a huge undertaking, and frankly, because I've been working in one way or another with or in the automotive industry. I mean, I worked in an assembly plant in Sainte-Thérèse, Quebec, like 40 years ago. And back then, I remember, and I don't know if you're, the people that listen to your show know about this, but 40 years ago, the Americans were really concerned about what they call the Japanese invasions. The Toyotas, the Hondas, the Nissans, and there were tariffs back then for Japanese cars, more than 60%, and that's what encouraged them to come and open plants in the U.S. and Canada. So I think it's a good lesson in history to see what happened with those car makers. They wanted to get some market share in Canada and the US. So keep in mind that like back in the mid 70s, GM had 50% of the North American it by itself, you know. And now those Japanese car makers, let's be honest here, they really kick some car makers' butts, the big three butts in the 80s and 90s. And now they are forces to be reckoned with. But what we are seeing right now is that the South Korean and the Chinese in particular, well, they're doing exactly the same thing that Japanese did to the American car makers 40 years ago.
I'll tell you a little story. 1970, the winter of 1975, 76, I was playing hockey in southern Manitoba, and I went into Winnipeg, and it was brutally cold. Winnipeg gets that polar vortex off Hudson Bay, and it was, minus 30 or some god-awful thing. And I was going to meet some people, some friends of mine, and a family friend said, "Well, look, why don't you take our Toyota?" It was a fairly new Corona. And I'd always driven, my dad was a mechanic. He was a GM guy because everybody had a brand back in those days.
Yeah.
And I drove that Toyota. I couldn't believe it. It was like driving a Swiss watch. Everything fit. The doors closed differently. The engine ran differently. It was a revelation. And here I am 40 years later, still driving Toyotas. And it was a completely different experience. And I haven't driven a Chinese EV yet, but from what I hear, it's that kind of a revelation. It's so much different than what we're accustomed to.
Well, if you want to go back in time, I can tell you that one of my uncles, who born and raised in Detroit, and was in the army for the American Army in the Korean War. And when he came back from the war, he started working at Ford in Detroit. And then when he moved to Canada, in the family, it wasn't possible for anybody in the family to buy a Japanese or a German car because we went to war against these guys. So that was the mentality back then. And I remember when one of my cousins bought a Volkswagen Rabbit back in the day. I mean, he wouldn't speak to her for 2 years. So that's how it was. So things have changed significantly since then, but it shows you how things were, I would say, politically positioned back then. But what I'm seeing right now with the Chinese conversation and Chinese car makers, with the tariffs that Canada and the US have imposed over 100%, it goes back to some kind of trade war, if not a real war. And I think it's going to have a lasting impact on the transition to electric vehicles beyond them being manufactured in China or not. So it's becoming a very politicized issue.
When President Biden put on the 100% EV tariffs last May, and
Yeah.
then Canada followed in September, and I've been interviewing Flavio Volpe, who's the head of the Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturing Association. You'll know Flavio well. But the argument then was the domestic manufacturers need some time to catch up. They're working hard. Like GM and Ford have made the pivot, but they still need some time before they get wiped out by Chinese competition if we don't put up these tariffs. That's one argument. So to protect local jobs, protect local manufacturing. And then the other argument is that the those manufacturers would have benefited from the competition, just like GM and Ford did when Toyota and Honda came to Canada back in the 70s. You know, I'll be honest. I remember in 1977, I drove a company vehicle, and the backing for the because I had to get under the hood for or under the dash for something to look for something was made of recycled Coke boxes. I mean, the quality of the domestic cars in the 70s was atrocious. They were so bad. And they upped their game because of the Japanese competition
Yeah.
beginning in the 80s. And so do we protect should we protect our manufacturers here and hope that they will apply themselves, or should we allow competition in and put their feet to the fire?
Honestly, I have to say that at EMC we believe that we have to find some kind of balance because we have to protect the workers. We also have to protect the consumers. What we have been recommending for a year now is that we do calculate how much advantage some car companies from China have when it comes to making cars. So in Europe, they did that calculation. We haven't done that. We just said, well, the US has said 100%. We'll say 100% because we want to play nice. We want to be nice with the US. And well, look where we are today. Between us, I feel that we have to strike a balance.
Daniel, I'd be curious to get your response to something. The reporting that I've done on what's going on in China is very clear that the Chinese, in 2007, 2008, undertook a very strategic approach to the auto industry.
Absolutely.
It didn't happen by accident. They
No.
said, okay, we're going to do two things here. We're going to scale up our manufacturing, and we're going to have all sorts of government programs and policies to support that. And then on the other side of that, we're going to scale up our adoption so that we create a domestic market for those electric vehicles. And eventually, our manufacturers will reach scale. Eventually, our adoption and our consumers' adoption will reach scale. And then this industry will really take off, and we can go export, and we can do all those things that we have ambitions for. And I Canada does not do that. I mean, we're so passive when it comes to this. But should we take more of a strategic approach?
Well, I would add one element to what China did. It was scaling up access to critical minerals and refining critical minerals. From an economic and a geopolitical point of view, this was huge. And listen, and back in 2006, so 19 years ago, I was having conversations with the federal government back then about developing an EV supply chain. And honestly, I could have been speaking Cantonese or Mandarin, and it would have been the same thing. I mean, they didn't understand a thing that I said. And I said, for geopolitical, national security reasons, access to critical mineral will become more and more of an issue, but not just for electric cars or renewable energy, also for the military. So no one listened back then. So just for you to know, 10, 15 years ago, some research done in Canada was financed by the US Department of Energy and the US Department of Defense for that exact reason. And folks from the Pentagon would go to the US government, talk to them about geopolitical strategy around critical minerals, and the US government didn't get it back then as well. So that's why China has so much access and has basically a stronghold on critical mineral and refining, and that this is becoming an issue not only for electric cars, but for the military as well.
I would agree with you, and I've read the speeches by American politicians under the Biden administration, where their dependence on Chinese supply chains uh, really hit home during the pandemic.
Exactly.
That was a big deal. And then they began. So here we are. There's a lot of talk about electric vehicles. We're going to electrify transportation for climate reasons. The Americans, for the last 4 or 5 years, have said, no, 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 no. National security is what motivates us.
Oh yeah,
Geopolitical positioning versus China is what motivates us.
exactly.
And that's why, when I listen to Mark Carney, who's the liberal leader for our American audience, and we're in a national election, And I hear him talk about climate, 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 and I think, dear God, we're still having the wrong conversation here. And one of the things, and I'll use Carney as an example because the other parties are no better than Carney. In fact, they're behind where Carney is, in my opinion. But here's the thing: he announced a critical mineral strategy the other day, and what he talked about, because he's an economist, right? He's got a PhD in economics from Oxford.
Yeah.
He talked about backward linkages from the critical minerals industry, but from mining. So
Yeah.
what that means is all the inputs that go into the mining industry, making sure that they were made in Canada. There was no conversation about what you do on the forward linkages. When you've mined those minerals, how do you refine and smelt them into battery metals? Once you've got battery metals, how do you turn them into battery cells? Once you've got battery cells, how do you turn them into a battery pack?
Yep.
That's the supply chain. And he completely missed all of that. And that's the real opportunity here with critical minerals is to put together the supply chain upstream from the minerals because North America, all of that is in China. And we're completely missing the boat here.
Well, actually, most of the critical minerals are not in China, but China buys it and refines it and transforms it and makes it into components, whatever. It could be batteries, but it could be something else. So, to your point, one of the reasons why we wrote that report was to talk about the EV industry as a whole, from mining to refining to assembly to infrastructure to electricity production. And when I talk to political parties these days during the campaign, what I'm saying to them is, guys, keep in mind that there are some jobs there that you cannot relocate. No matter what happens, whatever Donald Trump says, if we're talking about critical mining and refining, you can keep it here. If you're talking about infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure, electricity production and distribution, you're not going to move a hydro dam from Quebec to Maine. So these are jobs that can be created in Canada that won't go anywhere. This is a huge opportunity. A lot of people talk about, building pipelines across Canada to be less dependent on the US market. Listen, I'm not going to go into that, but my point is that, well, we have an opportunity as well to build an electricity grid across Canada so that we can be less reliant on US export when it comes to electricity production and distribution. And it becomes more and more of an asset for us, and we create job in Canada that will stay in Canada. So what you're mentioning is exactly what we are seeing in our report and what we are saying to political parties. We have to think about this differently and be a lot more strategic. And honestly, as a Quebecer, but I look at Canada as a whole for decades. We've been focusing on extracting natural resources, whether it's wood, oil, critical mineral, send it elsewhere for it to be refined, have the value added product being sent back to us. I mean, this is, to me, it's almost a neo-colonial economy. I remember back in 2009, Stephen Harper was then prime minister. He went to South Korea and he said, well, you guys make a lot of great things. You're innovators. Come to Canada, get your natural resources, and do your great products in South Korea. I couldn't believe that I would be hearing that, and that was in 2009. But I'm still hearing that today.
I'm going to put in a plug for an initiative that Energy Media launched last week. It's a national initiative called Canada 2050. And for viewers, if you'd like to sign the petition and get involved, you can go to our website at canada-2050.com. And Daniel, what we're proposing is a three-pronged strategy for the response to Trump's trade war. And the number one thing is add value to resources.
Exactly.
Number two thing, electrify. Electrify everything. Number three, build the infrastructure you need to support number one and two. That could
So
be
we're
ports.
exactly on the same page. That's
That's
exactly what we're saying.
exactly right. Because one of the things that I'm being convinced of, Daniel, is the work that I've done over the last 5 or 6 years at the global level, like interviewing experts who are, they're expert in China, in the economy and policy, and they're expert in what's going on in Europe and the United States, is Canada is like 20 years behind. And now that we've had this big economic shock where, Trump is pressuring our economy so we become the 51st state, this is a moment in history that won't come again. And this is the time for us to realize that we're behind and to catch up and to have a forward-looking strategy along the lines of what we've talked about here now. And your report comes it's very timely.
Yeah, yeah, and this is not a coincidence because I had a gut feeling last year that the conversation was going to pivot from climate and the environment to the economy. So that's when we looked for funding and we started working with EY because EY wrote the report. EY, which is a reputable firm, to say let's be unbiased here. We want to get the data, as much data as we can, coming from EMC members. We have almost 200 of them, and our members range from car makers to truck makers to bus makers. But we have members who are mining companies and utilities and research centers and universities. So we got all that data. Plus, we went outside of membership. We spoke to stakeholders across Canada and even in Europe. We got some studies done. We got some data that came from the International Energy Agency and Natural Resources Canada because we felt that we had to present this in an economic light. And what you're saying about critical mineral refining, value added products, basically, I've been saying this for decades now. Now people are starting to listen, but we have a lot of catching up to do. I absolutely agree with you. But this, to me, is exactly like you said, represents an opportunity. Crisis equals opportunity. So the way we present this, we present our report, is for Canadian elected officials, Canadian media, Canadian industry, and consumers to understand that we could be creating great jobs here for the future of the economic and the energy, and I would say the national pride transition. Let's put it that way. Because if we show Canadians, ordinary Canadians, that these jobs are going to be created in all provinces, in all regions of Canada, they will start to see the interest. And when Biden decided to develop the IRA, it was basically, as you said, in response to what was happening in China. They said we have a lot of catching up to do. We have to build our own plants, battery plants, renewable energy plants, car plants, because we have waited a long time. And let's be honest here, okay? Most car makers that I know that I've dealt with for the past 25 years, most of them did not want to do this. Most of them were not interested or were fighting the transition. They were lobbying against the transition. So this is no coincidence that Canada and the US is lagging behind because they have a lot of influence in Washington and in Ottawa. So now some car makers, the big three, for instance, are saying, well, now we need some catching up. I said, well, I've been talking to you about this for 20 years. And Toyota and Honda, some of them, have been trying any way they could to slow down the transition. The South Korean, on the other hand, are growing market share because they said, no, 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 we're not going to go the same pathway that the Japanese is using right now. So all of this is part of the conversation. Lobbying has done a lot to slow down or even stop the transition at one point.
I want to point out, Daniel, 'cause it's been a while since you and I talked, that Energy Media has developed an energy transition theory of change, and it has two parts. So the first part is the clean energy technologies, solar, batteries, EVs, heat pumps. They get on the bottom of the S curve and they take decades to mature and become competitive and to get better and better and better over time.
Yeah.
So all of those technologies now hit their inflection point, which is kind of the round part of the S curve, hit them in about 2020, 2019, 2020. And what that means for electric transportation is that now all of a sudden electric vehicles are competitive on a total cost of ownership basis,
Yeah.
for a whole lot of reasons. And now we're seeing exponential growth, rapid growth, and then it begins to disrupt industries. It's already, that
Yeah.
technology disrupted the auto industry, and then
Yeah.
it's going to disrupt the oil industry because that's upstream of the automotive industry. So major disruption is already begun
Yep.
on its way for Canada, and you can trace where the disruption's going by if you're familiar with the technology and you look at the data and the
Yeah.
evidence. And the uh, Canadian policymakers, because I talk about this stuff all the time out in Alberta, and it's like banging my head against the wall. Nobody wants to listen. Why? Incumbents. The
Yeah.
big three that you talked about, incumbents, whether it's automotive industry, whether it's in the utility industry, whether it's in the oil and gas company, wield a lot of influence in Canada, a lot of influence, and they lobby policymakers and they slow things down because it's in their business interest to get the most value out of the assets they've already paid for.
Yep.
And as a consequence, we miss opportunities because we're slow to pivot, and a lot of it is because we're getting political. Policymakers are getting political pressure from those incumbents.
Yeah. Absolutely. Uh, so, listen, I mean, I remember having conversations a long time ago, the House of Commons back in 2009, and I see all the lobbying that's being made so to slow down the transition. 20 years ago, back in 2005, the federal government signed a voluntary agreement with car makers to say, well, we will reduce GHG emissions by 2010 to the tune of 5.2 megatons. So since it was a voluntary agreement, they missed the mark by 95%. So now there's a regulation that's going to start next year, 2026, so that we reach 100% EV sales by 2035. And car makers, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, are fighting this tooth and nail. And I remember a year ago they were saying, well, the numbers are not good, EVs are not selling. Actually, if you look at EV sales across Canada in 2017, we're at 1.8%. And Q4 of 2024, we're at 18.9%. So we're almost 2 years ahead of schedule to reach our 20% by 2026 target. So 3 months ago, the pause in rebate for EVs from the federal government. Well, some car maker representatives came out and said, "Well, we can't reach the ZEV mandate, so we must get rid of the ZEV mandate." 2 weeks ago, they came out. They said, "Well, Donald Trump, the tariffs, we must get rid of the ZEV mandate." And some people ask me about this. Can we reach the 2035 100% ZEV sales by then? And I said, well, because they said, some car makers are thinking that this is not realistic. I said, well, to be honest, there's been a ZEV mandate in California since 1990 for 35 years. And for 35 years, some car makers have been fighting this. So this is nothing new. But if you go back to the 50s, some car makers were fighting the seat belts. And the 1970s, were fighting the anti-pollution systems. So for some companies, regulation, they never want regulation, whatever the regulation. They want the subsidies though. So when they come to us or they talk to media, they say we should let the free market run its course. But I've been saying to them, well, if you want the free market, why do you ask for subsidies? You know, because subsidies is not free market. So they want the subsidies, but they don't want the duties. So going back to our report, what we are seeing is that worst case scenario. Let's say Donald Trump tariffs, they last for years. What we are seeing is GDP and job will still grow 2.5 times between now and 2035. That's the worst case scenario. Medium scenario, 45% of jobs and transportation in general will be in the EV sector, from light to medium to heavy duty. If we're looking at a medium scenario, according to the EY report that they did for us, there are going to be more jobs created in Canada between 2030 and 2035 than the oil and gas sector. Can you believe that?
I absolutely can believe that because what happens, we report on the oil and gas sector, and they've been losing jobs since 2014,
Yeah.
and they're down about 30 or 40,000 jobs nationally. And what happens when mature industries come under price pressure, which is coming, is they adopt new technologies to replace labor. I mean,
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
this is nothing new. It's been happening for decades. It
Yep,
happens. You see it all the time in manufacturing with robotics and so on. So it's
perfect.
already happening in a big way in oil and gas. So here's a question for you. Um, I've argued for a long time that Canada, if it has a long-term future in EV manufacturing, it's to take its comparative advantage, which it would be EVs operating in cold climates. And that could be in resource sectors, like the oil and gas industry, forestry, mining, all of those kinds of things. And to develop expertise in making electric vehicles that work in those areas. So you go up the value chain instead of just producing, light vehicle, like, China produces a $9,000 electric vehicle. How are you going to compete with that?
Yeah,
But they're only just starting to think about heavy construction machinery, like excavators and those kinds of things. They're only starting to think about these big mining trucks. And there's a lot of opportunity there for Canada to move in now and get a foothold in that market, leverage our critical minerals capacity, leverage our other, our electricity system, the fact that we've got that we know such a terrific electricity system, leverage our comparative advantages, and then build out an EV sector that has, can create a niche in the global automotive market instead of just trying to be, everything to all people. And that's what I've been arguing, and I'm just curious what you think of that.
well, uh, so back in 2014, when I was still in government, we signed an agreement with California to do R&D based on temperature differences between California and Quebec. Because we said, we have the warm weather, we have the cold weather, we can do research here for batteries that work well in cold weather. So research has been happening in Canada when it comes to battery that perform well in cold weather. So it takes a long time, but things are moving, I would say, at a pretty good rate. Uh, I mean, there was some research done. There was a report published about 3 or 4 months ago by Dalhousie University about battery capacity and cold weather and longevity. And we are talking battery longevity that would go from, let's say, approximately 500,000 kilometers to 8 million kilometers.
Wow.
This would come to market. This would come to market before 2035. So this changes the game completely. I mean, this is so staggering a change that I was saying jokingly to some friends that I think that you will have to get the battery to be given as a legacy or in your will to your grandchildren because the battery will last so long that you'll be never be able to outlast the battery. But you're right. I mean, there's great research being done in Canada when it comes to EV batteries and cold technologies, and it goes beyond the batteries. It goes to the chargers as well, because we have to have reliable chargers. So it's not because it's being made in the US or in Europe that it can last in our cold weather. And I've seen that because we have tested, I mean, we have tested many different chargers in Canada in cold weather that just would not work. So this is stuff that folks from NRCan, I said, the National Research Council of Canada is working on. And they're all members of EMC, well, not NRCan, but NRC and universities like Concordia University. So we we must take advantage of our uniqueness, I would say, when it comes to weather and distances. Um, but I can tell you that, 2 or 3 months ago in January, I drove 2,500 kilometers between -5 and -25 to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, in snowstorms, in ice storms, with an electric car. But the cars have changed so much just in the past 5 years that it would take me 20 minutes to charge from 10 to 80%. With a former generation like a Chevy Bolt, it would have taken me an hour and a half. So things have changed that much in 5 years alone. So when we're talking about 2035, saying, are we going to be able to make it? Actually, it's not going to be an issue. The real issue is going to be the politics. So now we are facing a lot of posturing when it comes to EVs. Are you liberal or conservative? If you're conservative, you're for gas. If you're liberal, you're for electric cars. So this has become so politicized that it becomes social posturing. A lot of people will never be caught dead driving an electric car. It has nothing to do with technology.
I agree wholeheartedly, and that's one of the reasons why our theory of change focuses on technology change, disruption, and markets and economics. And I'll tell you a little story, Daniel. Back in November, I was asked by the Alberta Engineers Association. It's called APEGA. And they asked me to do a presentation on our theory of change. And so I laid it all out with charts and data and evidence. And 630 engineers joined the webinar, which is the bet one of the, is a very, very high turnout for them because there was a lot of interest amongst the engineering community, which is primarily oil and gas in Alberta. At the end of it, they said this was remarkably popular. The engineers really liked it because they said for the first time they had someone explain the energy transition in the way an engineer thinks.
Yeah.
And and when you explain how this is inevitable, it's like, 40, 100 years ago when Western Canadian agriculture changed from horses and big steam tractors
Yeah.
to tractors and combines, it
Yeah.
was inevitable because the technology was better, cheaper, and there were a whole bunch of other values
More
attached,
reliable.
and that's electric vehicles. And
Yeah.
it's a whole bunch of other electric technologies like heat pumps and stuff. But for this
Yeah.
context, for this conversation, it's electric vehicles, and it has nothing to do with whether you like a gas vehicle or whatever. It's the technology is better and cheaper. That's what consumers will buy, and that's where we're at. And we better get it. We need to get on. We need to shift our thinking, be more strategic, and maximize the opportunity that's being presented to us.
Yeah. If we're looking at the numbers from our report, what we are seeing is that by 2035, approximately 45% of the GDP in transportation for light, medium, heavy duty buses, trucks, cars, 45% is going to be in electric vehicles and electric vehicle manufacturing and mining. So this demonstrates that while some people think that it's not a thing or it's just a fad, well, the EY report says, no, 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 it's happening. It's happening faster than people think. So always keep in mind, as you said, that as technology evolves and people don't see this because it's not part of their daily routine or their daily life, how quickly the transition is happening a lot faster than people think. I don't know if you know about this, but I mean, in Q4 of 2024, EV sales in BC were above 20%. In Quebec, they were above 40%. In China, it's above 50% for the largest market in the world. In Norway, they're at 95% now. So yes, policies and politics do play a part, but technology evolving so quickly is making a huge difference. And the reason why we published that report was for Canadians, elected officials and media to understand that this was an economic opportunity, but we have to seize the moment. And I'm sure you've heard about François-Philippe Champagne saying this many times when they were talking about, supporting the opening of battery plants, the Volkswagen plant, the Stellantis plant, and other plants. From a geopolitical, from an economic point of view, we don't have a choice. If we don't make the transition to EV manufacturing, whether it's for light, medium, or heavy duty, there is not going to be an automotive market, an automotive industry in Canada in 20 years, not even in 15 years. So it's not as if we had a choice. We have a choice actually. We can let it go and say, well, we won't be a car maker anymore, we won't be a bus maker or a truck maker anymore. We'll just let whatever company or country bring in their products. But this for us, because we have the critical mineral, We have the know-how. We have a lot of qualified workers. We have a lot of research and development being done in Canada. We have a grid that's 84% renewable or clean. Uh, we are well positioned. Now we have to move faster because we started moving 3 years ago, 4 years ago at tops. Now we have to keep going.
I couldn't agree more, and we've been making the same kinds of arguments at Energy Media, Daniel. We're on the same page on this. Well, look, thank you very much for this. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and uh, I highly recommend the report. I'll put a link in the
Please do.
description when I post the video. And I would encourage everybody to please, if reach out to Daniel at Electric Mobility Canada. Reach out to me at the Energy Show at gmail.com, energy with an I. And we really, oh, and by the way, and check out Canada-2050.com. What we're trying to do is create a public, a national, a parade, if you will, a public movement of Canadians demanding change, demanding that we modernize our economic development strategies and we get in line. We start doing some of the things like we've talked about today,
Yeah.
because the politicians, our policymakers don't get it, and so we need to do this grassroots movement in order to put the pressure. We have to build a political constituency for change. Is
Yeah.
really what it comes down to. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for this, Daniel.
My pleasure. And I would say that when we're talking about, build Canadian, buy Canadian, I mean, this is to be part of the conversation. Absolutely.
Agree.
Thanks a lot.